Hey everyone! Tonight we're diving into the dimly lit stone hallways of medieval convents, where women kneel on chilly floors for hours, their breath forming mist in the early morning gloom. You can almost hear the soft rustle of fabric as a nun sways gently, her eyes rolling back, her lips moving in quiet ecstasy. Around her, the other sisters watch with a mix of wonder and concern, because she's seeing things they can't, blazing wheels of fire, Christ's bleeding wounds floating in the air, angels with wings that shimmer like oil on water. This is the realm of female mystics, where the line between hunger and holiness, between a neurological episode and a sacred encounter, became incredibly faint. This story might clear up mysteries you've never had answers for, like why so many medieval women described nearly identical visions, or how nuns without formal education created theological works that rivaled those of university scholars. So, before we explore this tale together, please take a moment to support the channel by subscribing, liking, and sharing this video, or leave a comment below if you really enjoy what I share. Tell me where you're listening from tonight, whether it's a cozy bed in Toronto or a quiet room in Melbourne, or just share what drew you to this particular story about mystical visions and medieval women. Your engagement helps grow this channel and brings these historical enigmas to more curious minds like yours. Now, let's keep the lights soft. Turn on a fan for a gentle hum to make the story feel more immersive. And let's set off on tonight's journey together. Imagine yourself in 13th century Europe, where the church controls every aspect of life, and women hold a unique place in the spiritual order. They can't become priests, preach in public, or study at universities, yet they're producing some of the era's most profound religious experiences. While male theologians debate God's nature in Latin texts, women are encountering him directly, or so they claim through visions so powerful and physically overwhelming that witnesses record screams, levitation, and bodies stiffening like boards. This wasn't limited to one or two exceptional people. Across Europe, from England to Germany to Italy, convents saw what we'd now call a wave of mystical visions. Women reported seeing Christ, the Virgin Mary, detailed scenes of heaven and hell, and receiving direct messages from the divine. Their accounts were documented, examined, sometimes celebrated, sometimes condemned, but always taken seriously in a way that feels strange to our modern, secular viewpoints. What's intriguing is the sheer power of these experiences. These weren't mild daydreams or calm moments of reflection. Female mystics described sensations bordering on the surreal colors not found in nature, sounds that pierced deep inside, physical pain that left no traces but felt completely real, and joy so intense it left them unaware. Historians still debate whether these women were truly touching something beyond the ordinary, or if biology, psychology, and culture combined to create moments that seemed utterly genuine to those who lived them. To understand why these visions mattered so much, you need to grasp the medieval perspective. In our world today, if someone claims to see angels, you might suggest seeing a doctor or therapist. In medieval Europe, visions were expected, recorded, and could build or destroy reputations. The Church taught that God spoke directly to the faithful, that saints often had divine meetings, and that the barrier between the earthly and heavenly worlds was thin, especially for those living in extreme devotion. But here's where it gets fascinating and a bit challenging for medieval leaders. If God speaks directly to a woman in a vision, does she need male priests to explain his will? If she gains divine wisdom in a state of bliss, does that wisdom carry more weight than the bishop's training? Female mystics created an interesting paradox. The Church needed their experiences to show God's active role in the world, but those same experiences threatened the male-dominated religious structure. The women who became famous mystics often started young, sometimes as children. You might enter a convent at age 7 or 8, not always because of a calling from God, but because your family couldn't afford a dowry for marriage, or wanted to gain heavenly favor, or simply because it was one of the few acceptable options for women who didn't marry. Picture being that young, removed from your family life, and placed in a community of women following strict rules set centuries earlier. The daily routine in a medieval convent would deeply change your body and mind. You wake for prayers in the middle of the night, matins at 2 a.m., then back to sleep before rising at dawn. Your day revolves around the divine office, the cycle of prayers at set times: lauds, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, compline. Each service pulls you from your work to kneel in the chapel and chant in Latin. Between prayers, you labor in silence, perhaps copying manuscripts in the scriptorium, with fingers cramping around the quill and eyes straining in the low light. Maybe tending the garden, pulling weeds while reciting psalms in your mind, or preparing simple meals in the kitchen that never quite satisfy your hunger. The rule of Saint Benedict, which guided most convents, called for moderation in everything, but convents varied in how strictly they followed it. Food, or rather, its scarcity becomes key to our story. In your convent, you eat twice a day when meals are provided, and only once during fasting periods, which fill much of the liturgical year. Meat is forbidden, except for the sick. So you live on bread, vegetables, a little cheese, some fish if you're fortunate. The bread is often rye or mixed grains, sometimes tainted with fungi that played their own part in mystical experiences. One unusual detail that rarely appears in history books: medieval nuns often slept in their full habits, including veils and layers. Imagine never feeling truly bare or individual, always wrapped in the identity of Christ's bride. Some historians suggest this constant physical reminder of religious role may have heightened the intensity of mystical experiences. You literally never step out of the character, never get a break from being a vessel for divine encounters. The convent where you live has thick stone walls that block summer heat and winter cold with equal inefficiency. Your cell, if you have a private one, is just big enough for a narrow bed and maybe a small table for prayer. Many nuns sleep in dormitories, with the sounds of others breathing and snoring denying any real privacy, even in sleep. The windows are small, the light always dim, the air heavy with incense from the chapel or the scent of unwashed bodies, since bathing was infrequent and seen as a potential indulgence of the flesh. In this setting, your senses start to function differently. Colors, when you see them in illuminated manuscripts or rare flowers in the cloister garden, seem almost too vivid to bear. Sounds echo oddly off stone walls. Touch becomes more acute because it's so rare. The brush of another sister's hand during communion, the cold chapel floor through your habit when you prostrate in prayer, the rough wool against skin that seldom sees direct sunlight. You're being prepared, though you don't realize it, for experiences that will test everything you know about the line between inner and outer reality, between your own mind and the divine presence that medieval Christianity promised was always watching, always available to those who suffered enough to reach it. Your body is changing too, in ways that wouldn't be understood for centuries. The mix of malnutrition, sleep deprivation, sensory sameness broken by ritual intensity, and the constant mental pressure to be worthy, holy, chosen by God for special grace. All of this is reshaping your neurology, setting you up for experiences that could make you a saint or lead to accusations of demonic possession, depending on who's judging and the current politics in the church hierarchy. You're lying on your narrow bed in the convent infirmary, your head throbbing with pain that feels like an iron spike being driven through your left eye. The pain began an hour ago as a minor shimmer at the edge of your vision, and now it's growing into something much worse. But here's the odd part. Before the intense pain hit, you saw something remarkable. Geometric patterns of light, zigzagging fortifications of brilliant silver fire, spreading out from a central point like ripples in a pond, but made of pure glow. These shapes moved across your field of vision for about 20 minutes, and within them, you swear you saw the structure of the universe itself, the design of heaven, the face of God in crystalline light. Welcome to the world of Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century abbess, composer, naturalist, and visionary whose experiences influenced medieval theology and who likely suffered from severe migraines with aura. If you could look inside Hildegard's brain during one of her famous visions, you'd see what neurologists now call a scintillating scotoma, a visual disturbance from cortical spreading depression, a wave of changed electrical activity moving across the visual cortex. It's beautiful, terrifying, and feels completely otherworldly when you have no knowledge of neurology. Hildegard described her visions with remarkable detail. She wrote about seeing a great star, most splendid and beautiful, surrounded by a multitude of falling stars, all in light that seemed to come from within the vision itself, rather than any outside source. She saw a bright light with the figure of a man inside it, architectural structures that appeared to represent divine order, circles within circles, wheels within wheels, all moving in complex geometric harmony. Modern neurologists examining her descriptions and illustrations, yes, she drew what she saw, immediately recognized the classic patterns of migraine aura. But here's where it gets intriguingly complex, and you have to avoid the urge to simply dismiss medieval mysticism with modern science. Even if Hildegard's visions started from migraine disturbances, that doesn't mean her theological insights were invalid, or that her experiences weren't deeply meaningful. She didn't just see lights and shapes. She interpreted them through the rich symbolic language of medieval Christianity, and in doing so, created some of the most advanced theological and cosmological thinking of her time. You need to imagine Hildegard's life to see how biology and culture worked together. Born in 1098 to a noble family in the Rhineland, she was the 10th child, and in medieval numerology, 10 was a tithe, a gift owed to God. At age 8, she was enclosed with an anchoress named Jutta in a small dwelling attached to a monastery. Imagine being 8 years old and literally walled into a building where you'll spend your childhood and youth with one older woman. Cut off from the world, your life reduced to prayer, silence, and occasional lessons in reading Latin. Hildegard later wrote that she had visions since she was 5 years old, seeing a reflection of the living light and perceiving things others could not. As a child, she learned to hide these experiences, sensing they marked her as different, potentially dangerous. Medieval children who saw things others couldn't might be celebrated as holy prodigies or whispered about as touched by demons. The line was thin and the consequences severe. The migraines, if that's what they were, would have started in childhood too. Migraine with aura often begins young and runs in families. Hildegard would have had no name for what was happening to her, no understanding of neurology or brain chemistry, no access to modern pain relief. What she had was a medieval Christian framework that taught her these experiences were divine communications, messages from God that needed interpretation and action. Here's a quirky detail often overlooked. Hildegard's visions always came with her full consciousness intact. She wasn't falling into trances or losing awareness of her surroundings. She described seeing her visions with soul sight while remaining aware of the physical world around her. This matches migraine aura perfectly, which usually doesn't involve loss of consciousness. You can be watching geometric patterns swirl across your vision while still able to walk, talk, and know exactly where you are. For Hildegard, this meant she could have a vision while sitting in choir during prayers, while working in the garden, while composing music. And indeed, she claimed many of her compositions came to her during these visionary states. The content of her visions was shaped by everything she had learned in the monastery. By the time she started recording her visions in her 40s, more on why she waited so long in a moment, Hildegard had spent decades absorbing scripture, liturgy, and theological concepts. When she saw circles of light, she interpreted them as the cosmos, as divine order, as representations of the Trinity. When she saw figures within the light, she recognized Christ, the prophets, the virtues personified. Her visions were both neurological events and sophisticated theological constructions. Historians still debate whether Hildegard truly believed she was seeing God, or if she understood on some level that these were products of her own mind, using the authority of visions to say things a woman normally couldn't. Medieval female mystics existed in a strange loophole in church authority. They couldn't preach or teach officially, but if God spoke through them in visions, their words carried divine weight. Hildegard certainly used her visionary authority, writing letters to popes and emperors, criticizing church corruption, and founding her own convent when the monks at her monastery tried to control her too tightly. She waited until she was 42 to begin writing down her visions, and she explained the delay with a story that's become famous. She claimed God commanded her to write, but she resisted out of humility and fear until she fell seriously ill. Perhaps an extended migraine episode, or a series of them. Only when illness broke her resistance did she begin dictating her first work, Civius Know the Ways to her secretary Volmar, a monk who became her lifelong collaborator and possibly the only person who fully understood the complexity of her experiences. The illustrations that accompany Hildegard's manuscripts are particularly revealing. Later copyists created detailed illuminations based on her descriptions of what she saw. Modern neurologists looking at these images see textbook examples of migraine visual phenomena. The fortification patterns, the central blind spots, the radiating geometric shapes. One famous illumination shows concentric circles of light with figures arranged in symbolic patterns. And if you've ever had migraine aura, you might recognize the quality of that light, the strange sense of it being both external and somehow generated within your own perception. But Hildegard's migraines, if that's what they were, gave her more than visions. The prodrome phase of migraines, the time before the pain hits, can bring unusual mental clarity, linguistic fluency, and creative insight. Some migraine sufferers report that their best thinking happens in this phase before the crushing headache arrives. Hildegard composed music that was far ahead of its time, wrote texts on natural history and medicine, created a constructed language. Yes, really, she invented her own alphabet and vocabulary, and produced theological works that earned her the unofficial title Sibyl of the Rhine. You're witnessing something remarkable here, a neurological condition that in another context might be purely debilitating, becomes, through cultural interpretation and individual genius, a source of authority and creative power. Hildegard's visions let her speak when medieval women were supposed to be silent, let her write when women were discouraged from intellectual pursuits, let her challenge bishops and abbots who would normally never listen to a woman's voice. The mainstream historical fact you need to know is that Hildegard of Bingen was the first woman to receive explicit permission from a pope to write theological texts. Pope Eugenius III, after having her visions investigated and authenticated, gave her authority to publish her works. This was unprecedented and opened doors for other female mystics. The quirky tidbit: Hildegard also wrote about beer, praising it as healthier than water, which, given medieval water quality, was accurate, and describing how hops could preserve beer, knowledge that helped establish beer-making practices still used today. Mystical visions and practical brewing advice, all from the same remarkable medieval mind. You've been living in your cell for 3 years now, and you're starting to forget what a crowded room feels like. The stone chamber measures perhaps 8 feet by 10, small enough that you can touch opposite walls if you stretch your arms out. There is a narrow window high up that lets in a sliver of light, but shows you nothing of the world outside, except the changing quality of daylight and darkness. You have a bed, a small table, a crucifix on the wall, and that's essentially it. This is your universe now. Every sensation has become magnified in the silence. The drip of water somewhere in the walls, the scuttle of a mouse in the corner, the sound of your own breathing, which sometimes seems so loud it must be echoing through the entire monastery. Welcome to the reality of convent isolation, where the architecture itself becomes a tool for reshaping consciousness. Medieval convents weren't designed for comfort or community in the way we understand it today. They were built to separate women from the world, to create enclosed spaces where the physical environment constantly reinforced spiritual purpose. The thick walls that kept you in also kept distractions out. No street noise, no glimpses of traveling merchants, no sounds of children playing or dogs barking, or the normal chaos of medieval life. Just stone, silence, and the regulated rhythm of prayer bells. The sensory deprivation you're experiencing has profound neurological effects that medieval people couldn't name but definitely utilized. When your brain receives consistent, unchanging input for extended periods, it starts to generate its own stimulation. This is well documented in modern research. Put someone in a sensory deprivation tank or isolation chamber, and within hours they'll start hallucinating lights, sounds, presences that feel utterly real, but originate entirely within the brain's desperate attempt to make sense of nothing. Now extend that isolation not for hours, but for years, even decades. Some nuns entered convents as children and died behind those same walls 70 years later, never once stepping outside the cloister. Your visual environment consists of stone walls, the dim flicker of candles, the same few faces day after day, the same chapel with its same crucifix and altar. Your auditory world is Latin chanting, bells marking the hours, and silence. So much silence that when someone does speak during the brief periods when conversation is permitted, their voice sounds strange, almost musical, loaded with more meaning than any words should carry. The cells where nuns slept varied by convent and by the wealth of the institution, but many were deliberately austere. You're not meant to be comfortable here. Comfort is worldly, a distraction from spiritual focus. The hard bed reminds you that this body is temporary, unimportant compared to the eternal soul. The cold reminds you of hell's opposite, or perhaps of purgatory's cleansing fires. Everything in the physical environment is meant to direct your attention inward and upward, away from earthly concerns and toward divine contemplation. But here's what the architects of these systems may not have fully understood, or perhaps understood perfectly well. When you remove normal sensory input, when you create environments of profound monotony punctuated only by ritual, you're creating ideal conditions for altered states of consciousness. The brain doesn't just passively receive reality, it actively constructs it from available data. When that data becomes too uniform, too predictable, the brain's pattern recognition systems start finding patterns that aren't there or generating patterns from internal noise. You might be kneeling in your cell, reciting prayers, when suddenly the quality of the darkness changes. The shadows in the corner seem to deepen, to acquire a presence. You blink, refocus, but the sense of something there persists. Is it a demon sent to tempt you? An angel come to test your faith? Your own imagination running wild after months of near-total solitude? In your medieval mind, the first two options seem more plausible than the third. You've been taught that the spiritual realm is more real than the physical one, that invisible beings constantly surround you, that the veil between worlds is thin for those who dedicate their lives to piercing it. Some convents practiced even more extreme forms of isolation. Anchoress's women, who took vows to be permanently enclosed in tiny cells, experienced sensory deprivation that bordered on the experimental. These women were literally walled into chambers attached to churches, with only a small window for receiving food and another for watching Mass. The enclosure ceremony was like a funeral in some regions. The last rites were read over the woman before she was sealed in, because she was dying to the world. Imagine choosing this, or having it chosen for you, and then living in that stone box for 20, 30, 40 years. Historians still argue whether anchoresses were more likely to experience visions because of their extreme piety and dedication, or whether the sensory deprivation itself manufactured mystical experiences that were then interpreted through religious frameworks. Probably both factors work together. Biology and belief creating a feedback loop where expectations didn't connect those effects to the contaminated grain in bad bread years. The conditions that promoted ergot growth were unfortunately common in medieval Europe. Ergot thrives in cool, wet weather, exactly the conditions that often prevailed in northern Europe. When rains came during flowering season, rye was particularly vulnerable to infection. The sclerotia that replaced grain kernels could survive winter and remain toxic for years if stored improperly. Medieval storage facilities were often damp, poorly ventilated spaces where ergot could lurk, waiting to be ground into flour and baked into the daily bread. Rye bread was particularly common in convents because wheat was more expensive, reserved for the wealthy or for altar bread used in the Mass. The poor ate rye, and nuns, supposedly renouncing worldly wealth, ate rye too. This meant that religious communities were disproportionately exposed to ergot-contaminated grain compared to wealthier households eating wheat bread. The mainstream historical fact here is that ergot poisoning caused numerous documented outbreaks across medieval Europe, killing thousands and causing mass hallucinations that were often interpreted as religious phenomena or demonic possessions. Let's talk about what ergot actually does to consciousness, based on modern research. The alkaloids in ergot affect serotonin receptors in the brain, particularly the 5-HT2A receptors, that are also affected by LSD and psilocybin. Activation of these receptors can produce visual hallucinations, altered time perception, synesthesia, where senses blend. You might see sounds or hear colors. Feelings of profound unity with the universe, dissolution of the ego boundary, and experiences that feel deeply spiritual or mystical. People who've taken LSD or other psychedelics in controlled settings often report experiences remarkably similar to those described by medieval mystics. Encounters with divine presences, visions of elaborate geometric patterns, feelings of cosmic consciousness, sensations of leaving the body, experiences of time stopping or moving nonlinearly. The fact that these experiences can be reliably produced by chemicals that interact with specific brain receptors doesn't necessarily invalidate them as spiritual experiences. That's a philosophical question beyond science, but it does suggest that at least some medieval visions may have had a pharmacological assist. The sensory effects would combine with existing religious expectations in powerful ways. If you're a medieval nun who's been taught that God appears in blinding light, and you suddenly see everything around you glowing with impossible radiance, due to ergot affecting your visual processing, you're going to interpret that as divine presence, not as a fungal toxin affecting your neurotransmitters. The visions you have will be populated by the images that fill your mind: Christ, Mary, angels, demons, because that's your cultural vocabulary for transcendent experience. There's also a dose-response relationship worth considering. Very low doses of ergot might produce subtle effects: enhanced colors, slight time dilation, feelings of significance that could be interpreted as spiritual sensitivity or divine favor. Moderate doses might produce full visionary experiences. High doses would cause the convulsive or gangrenous symptoms that were clearly recognized as illness. Medieval people weren't stupid. They could tell the difference between divine visions and the advanced stages of ergot poisoning. But the line between low-dose effects and early mystical experience would have been impossible to distinguish without modern pharmacological knowledge. You finish your bread and return to your prayers, unaware that the strange darkness in the grain you just consumed is beginning to work its way through your system, that alkaloids are crossing your blood-brain barrier, that your serotonin receptors are starting to fire in unusual patterns. All you know is that you feel expectant, alert, as if something important is about to happen. And because you've been praying for a vision, because you've been preparing yourself spiritually for a divine encounter, when the walls begin to breathe and the air fills with presence, you'll know exactly what it means. God has come to you in your cell, just as he came to the saints whose lives you've studied. The bread has become, in its own strange way, truly sacramental. You're kneeling in the chapel when it happens. A sensation so intense, so overwhelming, that your body goes rigid and you topple sideways onto the cold stone floor. Your heart is pounding so hard, you think your chest might split open. And then you feel it, a sharp, piercing pain in your left side, as if a flaming arrow has just passed through your ribs, but there's no arrow, no wound, no blood. Just pain that feels utterly real, and pleasure that feels even more real. A combination so paradoxical your mind can barely contain it. You're aware of the other nuns rushing toward you, their voices distant and echoing, but you can't respond because you're somewhere else entirely. You're in the presence of something vast and loving, and your body is doing things without your permission, levitating slightly off the ground. They'll later tell you your face was transfigured with an expression of joy they've never seen before. Welcome to the world of Teresa of Avila, the 16th century Spanish mystic, whose documented experiences of ecstasy, levitation, and physical rapture are so detailed, so carefully recorded, that modern neurologists can read her accounts and recognize the symptoms of temporal lobe epilepsy with remarkable clarity. Teresa's visions weren't quiet, contemplative affairs. They were full-body events that left her exhausted, sometimes unable to move for hours afterward. Her body marked by physical sensations that seemed to originate from beyond the material world. Teresa described her most famous experience in language that's both spiritual and deeply felt, a combination that intrigued many readers. She wrote about seeing an angel, not a large one, but small and beautiful, with a face so aflame that he appeared to be one of the highest types of angels who seemed to be all afire. The angel held a golden spear with a point that seemed to be on fire, and with this spear he pierced her heart several times, penetrating to her entrails. When he drew the spear out, she felt like her entrails were being pulled out with it, leaving her all on fire with a great love of God. The pain was so intense she moaned aloud, yet it was also so sweet that she wished the pain to last forever. This vision became famous enough that Bernini sculpted it in the 17th century. The Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, capturing the moment with such detail that some art historians and critics have debated whether it depicts religious rapture or something more earthly. Teresa herself seems to have understood the ambiguity, writing that the pain is not bodily but spiritual, though the body has a share in it. Indeed, a great share. She was describing an experience that bridged categories, simultaneously physical and metaphysical, painful and pleasurable, overwhelming and desired. Modern neurologists reading Teresa's accounts recognize several telltale signs of temporal lobe epilepsy, a condition where abnormal electrical activity in the temporal lobes produces a wide range of unusual experiences. Temporal lobe seizures can cause intense emotional experiences, feelings of presence, out-of-body sensations, hyper-religiosity, auditory hallucinations, visual hallucinations, and something called ecstatic bliss. Overwhelming feelings of joy and unity during the seizure itself. They can also cause automatic behaviors, periods of unresponsiveness, and post-ictal states afterward, where the person is exhausted and disoriented. Teresa reported all of these symptoms. She described periods where she couldn't move or speak, where her body became rigid or heavy. She talked about feeling her soul lifted out of her body, about sensing presences she couldn't see with her physical eyes, about hearing words spoken directly into her mind without passing through her ears. She experienced what she called raptures that came upon her suddenly, without warning, sometimes in public places where she found them embarrassing. She couldn't control when they happened or stop them once they started, which frustrated her because she was a practical woman who valued being able to manage her affairs and run her convents efficiently. The levitations particularly interest historians and neurologists because they were witnessed and documented by multiple people. Teresa herself was mortified by them and tried to hide when she felt a rapture coming on. She wrote that during these experiences, it seemed to me when I tried to make some resistance, as if a great force beneath my feet lifted me up. Witnesses reported seeing her body rise off the ground during prayer, sometimes several inches, sometimes higher. She begged God to stop giving her such public displays, writing that they brought her great distress because people treated her as if she was some kind of spectacle. Here's where modern medicine offers some interesting perspectives. Temporal lobe epilepsy can create powerful proprioceptive disturbances, confusions about where your body is in space. People experiencing these sensations genuinely feel like they're floating, rising, or moving, even when external observers see them remaining still or moving much less than they perceive. However, some witnesses did report seeing Teresa levitate, which suggests either mass suggestion, exaggeration in the retelling, or genuinely unexplained phenomena. Historians still argue passionately about which explanation fits best. The mainstream historical fact you need to know is that Teresa of Avila was canonized as a saint in 1622, just 40 years after her death. And in 1970, she became the first woman to be declared a Doctor of the Church, a title recognizing her theological contributions. Her writings on mystical theology and the stages of prayer remain influential in Catholic spirituality. The quirky detail: Teresa had a sense of humor about her mystical experiences and about herself. She once wrote, "I do not trust myself when I'm in one of these raptures," and told God, "If this is the way you treat your friends, no wonder you have so few of them," after a particularly difficult period. Let's talk about what temporal lobe epilepsy actually does to consciousness and why it might produce religious experiences. The temporal lobes, particularly the medial temporal structures, including the hippocampus and amygdala, are deeply involved in emotional processing, memory formation, and the sense of self. When abnormal electrical activity occurs in these regions, it can produce experiences that feel more real, more significant, more meaningful than ordinary consciousness. People with temporal lobe epilepsy often report hyper-religiosity, even between seizures, an intensified sense of cosmic meaning, a feeling that everything is connected, a desire to understand spiritual truths. During seizures, they might experience what neurologist V.S. Ramachandran has called the God spot, activation of temporal lobe regions that produce feelings of divine presence, transcendence, and unity. These aren't vague feelings. They are often the most powerful, most certain experiences of the person's life. Patients report knowing with absolute conviction that they've encountered ultimate reality, that they've touched something beyond the material world. Teresa's experiences fit this pattern remarkably well. She described feeling absolute certainty during her visions, a conviction that couldn't be shaken by doubt or rational argument. She knew she had encountered God knew it in a way that bypassed normal knowing, that was direct and undeniable. After her visions, she was exhausted, but also transformed, carrying a sense of the experience that shaped her behavior and understanding for days or weeks afterward. But here's where you have to be careful not to reduce Teresa's entire spiritual life to a neurological condition. Even if temporal lobe epilepsy triggered her ecstatic experiences, that doesn't explain the sophisticated mystical theology she developed, the successful reform movement she led within the Carmelite order, the practical intelligence with which she founded 17 convents across Spain, or the literary skill with which she described her experiences. She was a complex, brilliant woman who also possibly had epilepsy. The two facts can coexist without one invalidating the other. Teresa herself was surprisingly analytical about her experiences. She developed a sophisticated classification system for different types of prayer and vision, distinguishing between experiences she trusted and ones she considered potentially deceptive. She warned other nuns not to seek visions for their own sake, emphasizing that genuine spiritual growth showed itself in humility and charity, not in dramatic mystical phenomena. She submitted her writings to male theologians for approval, navigating the dangerous territory of being a woman who claimed direct access to divine knowledge in an era when the Inquisition burned people for less. The physical sensations Teresa described, the piercing of the heart, the feeling of entrails being drawn out map onto temporal lobe phenomena called visceral auras, where the person feels intense sensations in the chest or abdomen that don't correspond to any physical cause. These can be experienced as pain, pressure, heat, or even pleasure. Combined with the intense emotional content of temporal lobe seizures, such sensations could easily be interpreted as the physical touch of the divine, especially by someone steeped in the Catholic mystical tradition that emphasized suffering as a path to union with God. Teresa's writings reveal a woman who was simultaneously overwhelmed by experiences she couldn't control and determined to understand and contextualize them within her faith tradition. She wrote about feeling like a passive recipient of divine favor, yet she also worked actively to create conditions conducive to prayer. The Reformed Carmelite convents she founded emphasized silence, solitude, and contemplation. She recognized that environment mattered, that the physical and social setting shaped spiritual experience. This was sophisticated psychological insight for someone living 4.5 centuries ago, with or without temporal lobe epilepsy contributing to her understanding. You're sitting in the chapter meeting when the abbess calls you forward, and you know what's coming. She asks you to lift your sleeves, and when you do, the other nuns gasp. There on your wrists are marks that weren't there yesterday, reddish impressions that look almost like wounds, though no knife has touched your skin. By evening, similar marks appear on your feet, and a dull ache throbs in your side. You didn't create these marks consciously, yet here they are, your body manifesting the wounds of Christ's crucifixion. Some sisters look at you with awe, others with suspicion, and you feel both exalted and afraid. This is the phenomenon of stigmata, the spontaneous appearance the furthest possibilities of human awareness, and the persistent, haunting question of whether there's something beyond the material world that touches us in our deepest seeking. As sleep claims you now, let their stories settle gently into your dreams. Let their courage and complexity find a home in your sleeping mind, and rest in the knowledge that consciousness itself, whether in waking visions or in dreams, remains wonderfully, terrifyingly, beautifully mysterious, full of depths we're still learning to explore, still learning to honor, still learning to understand in all their strange and sacred complexity.